Well, good evening, bonsoir, et bienvenue. Welcome to all. Happy Pride. I see the numbers are starting to show up on the screen. So I'm sure more and more people will be joining us. But let me just take a minute to welcome you all. My name is Stuart Wheeler, and as the champion of the LGBTQ2+ community at Global Affairs Canada, it gives me huge pleasure to have been invited by our co-hosts tonight, the Irish Embassy and the Australian High Commission here in Ottawa, to act as your moderator for what's going to be a great event. Un gros merci à nos co-organisateurs, l'ambassade de l'Irlande et l'Haut Commissariat de l'Australie ici à Ottawa. Before I go any further, and while we're waiting for others to join us, I thought we should take a moment to acknowledge the fact that we who call Ottawa home live and make our lives on land that's the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Nous nous trouvons sur le territoire des Algonquins et nous sommes reconnaissants de pouvoir y être. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. Pour les francophones qui se joignent à nous ce soir, cet événement se déroulera primordialement en anglais. Mais si vous avez des questions à poser en français, je ferai de mon mieux pour les traduire et les présenter aux panélistes lors de la session des questions et réponses. Tonight, we've come together to share stories and ask questions and learn from each other. Really one of the most powerful things we can do as we expand our horizons and build bridges internationally. And what better time to do it than during Capital Pride Week, indeed during Pride season, a time when people around the globe are all at the same time celebrating, raising awareness, commemorating struggles and achievements, expressing themselves, being heard, being seen, and connecting. Marriage equality, our topic for tonight, in Canada, Ireland, and Australia was achieved in three very different ways, but all with the same goal in mind: achieving rights for the members of the LGBTQ community that would recognize that they could love whoever they wanted, and that love would be recognized, indeed celebrated, and protected by our societies. Canada was the first of the three countries to bring in marriage equality in 2005, when the Civil Marriage Act was enacted, granting marriage rights to LGBTQ Canadians nationwide, making it only the fourth country on the planet to do so, and the first outside of Europe. But it was by no means a singular debate or act. It was a major milestone in a journey that started decades before. In May 2015, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalize marriage equality by popular vote, with 62% of people voting yes. And in 2017, the Australian government conducted a voluntary postal survey to ask the Australian people whether or not they were in favor of marriage equality. 61.6% of respondents voted yes in the plebiscite, which led to the introduction of the Marriage Amendment Act in 2017. Our speakers tonight will help unpack how those achievements were reached, how we got to where we are, taking different paths, and no doubt each will also have their own reflections on what those moments meant for each of those societies, but also for themselves personally. We're thrilled to have an amazing panel with us tonight. The Reverend Dr. Robert Oliphant, Member of Parliament for Don Valley West, and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Good evening, Rob, welcome. Her Excellency Natasha Smith, Australian High Commissioner to Canada. Nice to see you, Natasha. And Second Secretary of the Embassy of Ireland, Laura Finlay. Really the brains behind the operation tonight. And we're really pleased that she and her team and the team at the Australian High Commission have put this together for us. The biographies of our panelists are included in the various Facebook event posts that have brought us here tonight, so I won't dwell on them now. Suffice it to say, though, that each of these panelists bring fascinating professional and indeed personal experiences to tonight's topic. In just a moment, each of the speakers will discuss the path that led to the recognition and adoption of equal marriage rights in their respective countries. They'll also share some personal experiences of their country's marriage equality movements. But before we get going, I just want to say that we want this to be as an interactive an event as possible. So don't be afraid to send us in your questions in the comment box beside the live stream video. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to tonight's first speaker, the Reverend Dr. Robert Oliphant. Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Bienvenue à tous, and very happy tonight to be sharing this platform with both Laura and Natasha, as well as you, Stuart. And I am not in Ottawa tonight. I am actually at our summer cottage, which is situated on the traditional land of the Madawaska-Rini Algonquin people. The Madawaska people, the Madawaska River was settled originally by the Madawaska-Rini people, and they are part of the Algonquin family. And it is a wonderful privilege to share this part of the world with them in respect and in understanding their aspirations for truth, reconciliation, and hopefulness in their pursuit of justice and equality in Canada. Reflecting on this tonight, I began to realize that I am the oldest person on the panel. I may be the oldest person of anyone watching this, either now or when we release a recording of it. And what I understand is that the journey in LGBTQ two-spirited rights in Canada has been evolutionary, not revolutionary. It was a long process that I would say began when I was 11 years old and just beginning to understand what sexuality was, and probably on the cusp of understanding my own difference as a gay man, when the then Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first Prime Minister Trudeau, said, "There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation." And that was a huge statement in 1967. It was the centennial year of Canada, 100 years of Confederation. And he was the Justice Minister. He was not yet the Prime Minister. And he began the public discourse, really, that took LGBTQI two-spirited rights out of kind of the bars or the streets or the shadows of Canadian discussion and put it on Main Street and in the mainstream. And every headline in the country was asking, what does that mean? And he was very clear. It meant that the state had to get out of the private business, the sexuality of people in Canada. And so that began when he became Prime Minister in 1968. He began that journey, which in 1969 led to the decriminalization of gay sex. And that did not mark the end of the journey. For me, it marked the beginning of the journey. And last year, we celebrated 50 years of that journey. Probably the most pivotal moment was in 1982, when again, Prime Minister Trudeau brought Canada's Constitution home and enacted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That led to openings of many legal cases and challenges that opened the way to full inclusion of lesbian and gay transgendered people in our society, especially through to the challenge in the courts that led to marriage equality. I have a kind of a parallel journey through this process. Growing up, 11 years old, maybe I'm going to be okay, through dark periods, through times of the bathhouse raids when we thought we had already made some progress, but went backwards again, through the history we had with HIV and AIDS as gay men particularly, and the stigma that was attached to that, many ups and downs. That was the sort of the public journey. The private journey was my role as a United Church of Canada minister. And we went through our own debate on that in the 1980s. I was ordained in 1984, and we were in the midst of a debate that culminated in 1988, which is really quite stunning now to think 32 years ago, my denomination said it was okay to be a homosexual and be in the pulpit and be in a pastorate. In 1990, they said it's okay for churches to celebrate gay relationships. We called them covenants, same-sex unions. And I did my first one that year. I celebrated it with people. And it wasn't till 15 years later that in 2005, Prime Minister Martin heeded the call of civil society, activist groups, and the court challenge, which led to the adoption of equal marriage in Canada. Interestingly, and I'm here at the cottage with my husband, my partner, Marco, and we've been together now almost 29 years. When marriage equality came in, we'd been together for 13 years. I actually fought for the right to get married and also for the right not to get married, to respect relationships in all their forms. However, my mother and my mother-in-law had a different idea. And my mother had been an activist. She had a gay son she was proud of. She had written letters. She had lost friends. She had talked about this to her neighbors and had really been out there as an activist. And then I wasn't getting married. And she said, Rob, I'm in my 80s. I could die before you get married. If you're going to get married, do it now so I can see it. Plus, I've had to go to the weddings of dozens and dozens and dozens of children of friends of mine. I want to invite them and get their presents. And so it was part of that. My mother-in-law had the same attitude. French Canadian Catholic woman from Eastern Quebec, growing up in a farming community. And between those two women, we decided we better get married. And so we had our legal wedding in a church, celebrated by a judge who had been part of the first Ontario Court challenge. He was one of the Superior Court of Ontario judges who had ruled that marriages should take place for the LGBTQ. So we're here tonight. Some of us married, some of us not, fighting for the rights to be who we are. And I still pay homage to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who I think really started that ball rolling, and to my ancestors in the Pride movements, who paid a huge price. Pride was not a great celebration event. It was a protest event. I remember it well in the 70s and the 80s, even into the 90s, where it was risky to go to Pride. Now it's a bit of a party, but we remember that we're not done yet, and we'll keep going. So that's where I am. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Really interesting to hear how you talk about it and reflect a little bit. I love what you say about your mother wanting you to get married. We'll talk later about how I withstood the same pressure. And thank you for fighting for my right not to get married, even though I've been with my partner for 20 years. Next, I want to go chronologically, just so that we can follow that path. So we'll go to Laura to hear a little bit about the campaign that happened in Ireland.
Yeah, and I suppose it's similar for us in Ireland too. One of the unintended consequences of marriage equality was all the extra pressure from the Irish mammies wondering when their kids are going to get married. So that happened for us too. But I suppose I want to go back before I talk about the marriage equality campaign, kind of back to the beginning of everything, because, you know, we had the Stonewall riots in 1969 that inspired this like sea change across America and further afield. But for us, like in Ireland, you know, homosexuality wasn't decriminalized until 1993 after like a lengthy court proceeding by now Senator David Norris. So, you know, to kind of give you an insight into what Ireland was like back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like in 1982, for example, there was a series of gay bashings in a park in Dublin, and one gentleman was actually murdered by this gang, and the judge let all 5 assailants walk free from court because he was like, this could never be considered a crime. It was a public service that these people were doing. And then, you know, a few weeks later, like 900 people marched from a place called Liberty Hall in Dublin to like Stephen's Green to kind of protest this. And that was the first sort of mass demonstration for gay rights in Ireland at the time. You know, it was in the 1970s before anybody started campaigning on anything. So the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform was founded by Senator David Norris, who went on to have homosexuality decriminalised after his court cases. And then two women that actually went on to become presidents of Ireland, Mary McAleese and Mary Robinson, were both involved in that as the legal advisors. He took his first case in 1983. It was refused. He took to the European Court of Human Rights at the late 80s. And then in 1993, it was finally signed into law that homosexuality was no longer a criminal offence in Ireland. And in 1993 as well, Dr. Lydia Foy first applied to the Registrar General in Ireland to get a new birth cert to reflect her female gender, and this was refused as well. And I bring this up because the trans rights movement and the marriage movement actually became very important to each other as that proceeded. So another example of what Ireland was like in the 70s and 80s, a state broadcaster was set up called RTE, and at the time people were outraged that it was showing sex on television and interviewing gay and lesbian people, and it was actually said in the floor of the Oireachtas, which is our parliament, that RTE was responsible for opening the floodgates to lust in Ireland. So that's the kind of context they were in. In 2005 then, the Transgender Equality Network was set up to fight for trans rights in Ireland, and kind of alongside what Dr. Foy was doing, where she was fighting for gender recognition, a gender recognition advisory group was set up. And in 2013, the draft heads of bill were released to the public on that. And one of the requirements at that time to have your gender recognized was going to be that you had to be single, because otherwise de facto same-sex marriage would have existed. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that happened along the way. So then in terms of marriage equality itself, in 2003, former Senator Catherine Zappone and her wife, Annalise Gilligan, got married in Canada. They came back to Ireland and applied to the revenue commissioners to have their marriage recognised so they could get the same tax allowances and entitlements that other married people got. The response to the revenue commissioners said no, and that they weren't going to allow their claim, and I think cited the dictionary definition of marriage as being between a man and woman. And at the time I was involved with the Union of Students in Ireland, and I think one of the campaigns they started was putting new definitions into dictionaries and bookshops in Dublin of, that marriage could be between two people. So in 2004, Catherine Zappone and Annalise Gilligan took their case to the High Court, and it was deemed the case was unsuccessful because the judge's view was that the Constitution is a living document, but that the definition of marriage has always been constant. And that's why eventually we had to go to a referendum, why it couldn't be just brought in through an act of parliament. However, in 2009, the government did bring in civil partnership, which was quite divisive because it had 169 less rights than civil marriage did at the time. So, we were all joking at the time that, will you marry me is very different to will you civilly partner in certain rights that cohabitants bill me. It's slightly less romantic on one level. So we had one group, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, that were advocating for an incremental approach. And then we had other sort of more activist groups. For example, LGBT Noise tore up the heads of the bill for civil partnership on stage at Pride celebrations that year. And then at the same time, simultaneously, they also set up the March for Marriage, which was kind of like a mini Pride, and got about 6,000 and 7,000 people out in the streets marching for marriage equality, holding signs like first-class taxpayer, second-class citizen, etc. So then the group Marriage Equality kind of worked to appeal to, I guess, Middle Ireland, to kind of change the hearts and minds of people, to get them to kind of vote, like reaching out to people that wouldn't have before, because obviously if it was going to go to a referendum, it couldn't just be the LGBTQ community that they had on board, it had to be everybody else. So they started a campaign that's like, you're not out until you're out to your TD. So a TD is what we call MPs at home. So basically we had a phone bank where we'd call everybody and tell them they had to go into their local TD's office and say, I'm gay, I'm in your constituency, I want you to fight for this. They also released a video online called Sinead's Hand, and it's this guy that goes from house to house to house all over asking people for permission to marry his girlfriend. And kind of the tagline is, how would you feel if you had to ask 4.6 million people for permission to get married, which I think was a really important point to make. So all of this came together to put a lot of pressure on the government. And then once the date of the referendum was announced, kind of, everybody started working towards the same thing. All the LGBT groups joined together, formed a group called Yes Equality. So every referendum and election in Ireland is kind of done through like poster campaigns, a lot of it, as well as like people knocking on door to door. So for the Yes campaign, it was posted like Yes Equality, vote yes because marriage matters. Together we can make 2015 the year of equality and fairness. So they always just focused on the equality issue of it, which I think was brilliant. Then we had campaigns like people did videos on Call Your Granny. So people were ringing, recording themselves, phoning their grandmothers on YouTube and asking their grannies, will they vote? We had these like celebrities that got involved. So there's, singers like Daniel O'Donnell and TV presenters like Gay Byrne, who, the grannies of Ireland absolutely love. So as soon as the granny saw, yes, Gay Byrne says vote yes, Daniel O'Donnell says vote yes, I'll go out and vote yes. There's a Irish band called Snow Patrol. I don't know if people are familiar with them, but they said the campaign could use their song Just Say Yes in its sort of campaign videos and things, which is brilliant. And then I think one of the biggest parts of what actually won it in the end was the Get the Vote to Vote or Home to Vote campaign. So in Ireland, if you have been living abroad for longer than 2 years, you don't vote anymore. We don't have postal votes unless you're like a diplomat in the army or working for the country abroad. So anyone that had left the country less than 2 years previous to the referendum was able to vote. So they started this huge campaign to get people to go home to vote. So people flew from all over the world to go back to Ireland to vote yes for marriage equality. And an Irish comedian at the time said that home to vote is like when you're watching The Hobbit and that army of elves you've forgotten from earlier in the film arrives over the hill to save the day. So, that was kind of the campaign itself. The government, like all major parties were in favor of marriage equality. We had a government minister who went on to be our prime minister, actually came out in the middle of the campaign, which I think did great things for different parts of Ireland. And yeah, I think people just really got their families involved, which was really important. The campaign appealed to people in a way that had never really, set people's minds on fire before. Like even my own mother, she wouldn't be sort of very politically active, but the No campaign made it all about children and biological families and everything. And me and my brother are adopted, so that obviously upset my mother a lot, that the No campaign is kind of invalidating non-biological families. So it's different things like that that got people involved. And even my own grandmother was going around wearing a Yes Equality badge at the time. So it kind of just did appeal to everybody. And luckily it did pass by 62%. And, later that same year, the gender recognition bill was released and trans people no longer had to get divorced to have their genders recognized. So, there was a huge impetus on the trans community as well to have marriage equality brought in. But I think I've probably gone over time, so I will stop talking and can fill you in later. So thank you.
No worries, Laura. Thank you very much. It's fascinating to imagine such rapid change, and perhaps it wasn't. And we'll get into a little bit about the different trends and groups and demographics, but perhaps it wasn't a sea change in the hearts and minds of modern Irish people, but really in the institutions and in the vision of itself as a country. I think it's just fascinating. I had the honor of serving as Canada's ambassador to Iceland, and I remember as well there a very small society, people talking about how in the space of 10 years, kind of, they had gone from a society that where it was very difficult to be homosexual, to be out in the community, to one that was leading the way in many ways, and it all had to do with people knowing people. Everyone knew someone, and in Iceland, everyone's related to everyone. So everyone had someone in their family that and it became a personal face on it. So it's interesting that you talked about how families were getting involved. Let's go to the other side of the planet. Although Natasha's here in Ottawa with us, Your Excellency, but hopefully. We'll have some people join or watch this later on from your side of the world, and we'd really like to hear how the most recent of these three cases came about in Australia.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And I want to do a big shout out to Laura. She is absolutely the brains behind this, and as everyone can tell from the presentation that she just gave, that she is somewhat of an expert in the process in Ireland, and I've learned a lot from her, and I do thank you. I also want to echo your acknowledgement of country. I am very pleased to say we're also on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And behind me, you'll see that I have all three of our flags, which includes not only the Australian national flag, but also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island flag, and a couple of others that people will be familiar with, I'm sure. I thought I might reflect a little bit on bouncing off a bit of what Rob and Laura have said, not to give a comprehensive, but a bit of a potted history around LGBTIQ rights in Australia, but then focus very much in on our postal survey, because I think it was fairly unique and not what anyone had anticipated even a few years earlier, because of the way the debate was going and what sort of commitments were being made. Like both Rob and Laura, you know, that element of protest and pride parades that now are, you know, Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, the preeminent pride event worldwide, hashtag World Pride in Sydney 2023. You know, it started in 1968 as a protest, and many of the 68ers, as they're known and revered, lost jobs, lost family members because of being outed and being involved in those marches in the early days. And from the point of view of the decriminalisation story, you know, first Mardi Gras 68, the first state, and this was done state by state in Australia, the first state to decriminalise homosexual acts was South Australia in 1975. The most recent, but the last as well, Tasmania, 1997. And my home state of Queensland, 1990. So, you know, there's that kind of backdrop, I think, is important to the marriage equality debate and journey. In terms of marriage in Australia, until 1961, marriage was actually the purview of the states and territories. So it wasn't federally legislated, but in 61, the Marriage Act came in and set out the requirements for marriage to be legally recognised, and that really took away that responsibility from the states. And I'll reflect back on that, because a few states tried to take that responsibility back unsuccessfully, but both the ACT and Tasmania did that at various times. So we've had the Marriage Act in 61. I suppose while a lot of struggle in between 61 and say 2004, the next really major step, I suppose, in the marriage equality process, and of course a lot of activism in the meantime, and the Australian Marriage Equality as a lobby group actually was established, I'm pretty sure in 2004, in the lead up to changes that were actually made by the then government to the Marriage Act, because the Marriage Act actually was fairly open, and therefore didn't preclude, if you looked at the letter of the law, equal rights for marriage. And it was amended in 2004 to actually explicitly say that marriage was between a man and a woman. And so that actually, there was a lot of hope that there was more that could be done to bring about marriage equality, and that was kind of a pretty definitive moment where you know, the Marriage Act was amended in that way. Between 2004 and then I'll fast forward to 2016, a number of marriage equality bills were introduced into the federal parliament, where this had to now happen, because it's the federal law that an act that was preeminent. All of those were either defeated or lapsed. The states had a crack at this in 2012 and 2013, both the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is, and Tasmania governments both tried to bring in marriage equality at the state and territory level. They were defeated in the High Court. They did have marriage equality very, very briefly, and in Canberra, certainly, people raced out, and you know, there were marriages right through to kind of the early hours of the morning as people tried to get in the kind of that very small window. But you know, you were doing that knowing that the High Court was about to actually change this back. So the kind of the if you fast forward and the pointy end of our process, I suppose, really started in 2016, because a lot of debate around marriage equality in 2004 that didn't go away in the meantime, but the next moment, if you like, in terms of change, was that in the 2016 election campaign, the now government promised or committed to have a compulsory plebiscite on the issue of same-sex marriage. Now, once in government, they couldn't actually get that through the Senate. The idea of a compulsory plebiscite was defeated. And so the kind of fallback became a voluntary postal survey. Now, even that was also challenged in the High Court, whether or not this could go ahead for a range of reasons. That challenge was defeated. And so September 2017, all our surveys were mailed out, and the postal survey began. I should say that in the lead up to that, the criteria for being able to participate in that postal survey is you had to be on the electoral roll. And something I'm very proud of is the fact that it's compulsory to vote in Australia, but you do have to be on the electoral roll. And I forget the exact numbers, but like 150,000 people quickly got themselves on the electoral roll so that they could participate in that survey. And so we're pretty conditioned as Australians to vote. Extraordinarily, even in a voluntary postal survey where there were all these campaigns to teach millennials what a postbox was, because you had to post a piece of paper back in. Thankfully, it was a self-stamped envelope. You didn't have to go to a post office and buy a stamp. I think that might have shifted the numbers a bit. But extraordinarily, 79.5% of eligible voters participated. Now, I won't point fingers, but in countries where there's not compulsory voting, not that many. That percentage is higher than the percentage that is, elected G7 leaders. I mean, this was the participation was incredible. And we kind of had this process where you got your ballot. You had then a period of time in which to make your decision and send that in before the Australian Bureau of Statistics then collated the results and announced them. And a lot of campaigning, of course, in the intervening period. There were a range of groups involved. The pro-marriage equality. The Australian marriage equality lobby was very strong, but so were those groups that were encouraging a no vote, and it was partly a get the vote out as well as get the two camps trying to get people to vote either yes or no. So as Stuart mentioned, 61.6%. So I'm going to round that up and equal Ireland at their 62% voted yes, that didn't make any change, of course. That's a postal survey. That was a result that then needed process in Parliament actually for us to actually have the legislation to amend the Marriage Act in order for marriage equality to be legal. And so there was the announcement was made on the 15th of November by the head of the Bureau of Statistics. I remember very well where I was, who I was with, and the reaction that I had and others in the room. A bill was immediately submitted to Parliament, tabled in Parliament. It had cross-party support. It went through our Senate, our upper chamber. The third reading was passed on the 29th of November, was introduced to the House of Representatives on the 4th of December, and it was passed on the 7th of December and given royal assent on the 9th of December 2017. And the first weddings, unless you had special permission because of extenuating and compassionate circumstances, you then had to give notice. So the first marriages took place then in January 2018. And during 2018, 6,538 same-sex marriages, so 5.5% of all marriages in Australia were marriages that wouldn't have been able to happen in 2017. So, so the postal survey was, I mean, it was I think as was the experience in Ireland, it had a lot of impacts on a lot of different people. Some of it was very positive because, you know, friends and family were, if you like, coming out, pardon the pun, in support. But for many others, it was not a happy story. And in fact, friends and families were lost through the process because of the debate that was happening within families around dining tables, etc. And as with all these sorts of processes, I suppose the edges of the fringes of the campaigns, you know, weren't very pleasant to have to experience. From a personal point of view, it was quite surreal in some ways, because while this process was going on, my now wife and I were planning our own wedding. We got married on the 15th of December 2017, and we couldn't bank on being married under Australian law. So in fact, because my wife is British, British Australian, we were able to be married. In fact, one of the last couples that was married under British law, but in Australia. And in some ways that was a bit bittersweet, because it had got royal assent on the 9th. We got married on the 15th, but we had a reason to do it sooner rather than later, and that was leaving to come to Canada. So that maybe I'll stop there, Stuart, but just to give people an idea of that process, which is quite different. But we now do have federal legislation. The Marriage Act says that marriage is between two people.
Well, it's great, and it's so interesting to see how the processes were different, how the issue evolved differently. I've got a question to follow up for each of you, but I want just to take a moment to encourage our audience now to start submitting questions. I see a couple of them coming through, and just as people are doing that, feel free to type your comments, questions into the comment box on the live stream. You can address questions generally, or ask a specific question about something that might have happened in one of the three countries, or about your question can be directed to a specific speaker, and then we'll try and get to those. But before we go there, your comments, Natasha, were a good segue, because at the end, the sort of personal element of it, I think it's really interesting to look at these different journeys, not always just through the lens of observers or perhaps participants in various elements of campaigns or movements, or if you're working in government, or if you're elected in government and you see different things happening in your society, you may be part of those breakthroughs. But for each one of us, I think it's also these are debates that affect our personal lives, or could directly impact our lives. And Rob and Natasha, both of you have mentioned that you are now both married. I think Laura is as well. I thought I saw a ring last time, or we'll get to that in just a second. But I thought we'd start there and see what each of you could say in terms of your own personal reflection on the achievement of marriage equality in your own country. What did that moment mean for you? What did that maybe what did that campaign mean for you? I know particularly in Laura's case, you were very involved in the campaign, but for others, we were part of a community that was very involved in the campaign. So just maybe a reflection on how did you live it? What did it mean for you? And why don't we start again, Rob, with you. I mean, when you were a little boy, did you dream of getting married someday? Could you ever have dreamt that today you'd be married to Marco?
I don't think I could dream that, actually. I think what I would start by saying is that just a few days after the legislation received royal assent to change our understanding of marriage in Canada and give equal rights, Mark and I were walking up a street at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto, and a mother was with her two children, and they were maybe 6 and 8 years old. And in front of us and in front of them was a same-sex male couple, a gay couple, and they were holding hands. And at one point, they kissed. And the little boy looked up to his mother and said, "Did you see those two men kissing?" And she said, "I did. And you know something? Now there's a new law and they can even get married if they want to." And there was a moment, something went off in that moment where I thought, when I was 6 or 8 years old, that was never it wasn't in the ether. It wasn't in any public discourse. It was barely in private discourse. It was still a shadow existence. And to go from that, and as I said, Canada was more evolutionary, and other countries it's been more revolutionary. This was a long 50-year journey where we are at today. And it was sort of a 35-year journey up to the point of marriage equality. There is still a revolutionary nature to it. And these are human issues. This is in the long march of human history, the long march of humanity. Things don't change quickly, and institutions don't change quickly. And for this to happen actually changes something, and it has to do with the validation of one's person through the institution being offered. And it has to do with a legitimacy, an ordinariness that was revealed. Now, are we there yet? No, we can get into that a little bit later. We've got lots more to do in this regard, but it is something about the fact that there gets to be a stamp of approval from the government that it's different than saying you're okay. You're not only okay, you're like us in those ways. You have those same access. So the last point I would make is, and my history was very much, my civil action was much more in the church than it was domestically, politically. That's where my venue of action was. And from 1984 to 1988, I was one of a small group of people that was fighting for ordination rights in my denomination. And this was hugely challenging for rural congregations, for multicultural congregations, ethnic congregations, and little old white men and women. And it was referred to for years as the issue. And everybody just called it the issue. How did you do through the issue? Did you lose members with the issue? Did this happen with the issue? And at one point I lost it and I said, it is not an issue. It is me. It is human. I am not an issue. I am me. And I think I woke up my colleagues, and gradually we stopped calling it the issue, because it's not the issue. It's about men and women, little boys, little girls, trans people trying to find their way in the world and saying, we're okay.
Thanks for that. Laura, in your case, as I said, you played a major role in the LGBT community, and obviously in the campaign from your own comments. What was it like in Dublin at that time? Not just to have a front row seat watching this historic event happen, but to be part of the debate. How did that affect you in your life?
I think so for me, I was very involved with it for the guts of from about like 2006 to 2014, kind of loads of different of the LGBT groups at home. I was involved with volunteering for. I was doing the phone banks for marriage equality to encourage people to come out to their TDs. I helped like train all the stewards for the March for Marriage. I worked for the Union Students in Ireland, etc. Just trying to always like raise awareness amongst the public in Ireland. But when it came down to actually going door to door to like knock on people's doors to ask permission to get married, I actually just couldn't do it, because for me, like personally speaking, obviously not speaking as representative of the Irish government, but like very personally speaking, I do not agree with the concept of having a referendum on someone's basic human rights, just personally, because I don't feel like a majority should get to vote on the rights of a minority. But it is what we have to do because of the way our constitution is set up. And now it's kind of like, it's an amazing feeling that it can't be taken away from us because it's in the constitution. So it's kind of, it's two sides of the sword, basically, where on one hand, like, I don't like that we have to do it that way, but on the other hand, I'm glad that we did, because now we have it forever. But I suppose there was a great energy around the campaign and between sort of the yes side, because I'm trying to think the best way to like describe this. So the yes side, I think, was very, very positive. It just kept the focus on equality and was all like rainbows and positive personal stories and things. And everyone, it seemed at one point that everyone in Ireland was wearing these little badges that says yes, equality, and like Paul, which is it in the Irish language as well. So we used to make jokes at the time that as soon as people stopped wearing these, how are we going to know who was nice or not? Like even my grandmother was going around wearing one of these badges. So there was, as I said, like posters were a big part of the campaign. So you had your yes equality posters, but I went back over my kind of photos and just wrote down some of what was on the no posters. And I just want you to imagine what it would have felt like to be like, let's say, like a queer teenager in Ireland at the time, trying to, you're struggling with your sexuality. And this is what is pervasive everywhere. Don't be silenced, vote no. 2 men can't replace a mother's love. Surrogacy, she needs her mother for life, not 9 months. We already have civil partnership. Why do they need marriage? Mothers and fathers matter. Remember your equal right to vote no, and children deserve a mother and a father. So that was just everywhere. So for me personally, I felt like I was on trial. It almost felt like you're a criminal, that you're constantly having to justify your existence. So that's when it came down to actually knocking on the doors, I couldn't bring myself to do it, because I would just have gotten so upset if someone said to my face, actually, sorry, I don't think you deserve the same rights as we do. And, even at the time, one of our neighbors took it upon themselves to take one of the no leaflets saying that, like, this wasn't an official no campaign leaflet, but somebody put these together where it had like just awful stuff written on it and helpfully underlined certain passages and put it under our door. So, when you were dealing with that, I just didn't think I could do the other side of it. But, in the end, up until the night before, I actually wasn't sure it was going to pass. Like, I saw the home to vote stuff and it did give me some hope. But then I was also, there's always that part of you that doubts it. You're like, this is Ireland, 22 years ago, it was still illegal to be gay. Like, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Woke up the morning of the result. It was like 9 o'clock. They'd started opening one of the ballot boxes in a very working class area of Dublin. It was just a tidal wave of yes. And I was like, okay, this is actually okay. So we got up, we went into Dublin Castle where the count was happening with all of our friends. By 11 o'clock, the no side had conceded. Now we had to wait until 7 p.m. that night to have, because we count everything by hand. We had to wait until 7 o'clock to have the official vote. But like, as soon as it was announced, there was thousands of people in Dublin Castle. Everyone started crying, cheering. People were dancing on the streets. And, I think if the referendum had gone another way, people, of course, would not have been dancing on the streets. But I do think it had an impact on people's mental health. And I know that when Australia was thinking of doing their postal vote, they did do a survey in Ireland to ask the LGBT community, like, what we thought of it. Should they do it? Is this a good idea? And everyone's kind of like, no, it's really bad for your mental health. But at the same time, it was something that, we had to do, and we did it in the end. But when you consider that even divorce was illegal in Ireland until 1994, and then we have marriage equality and very progressive gender recognition legislation, I think we've got a lot to be proud of, and I'm really happy that I was part of the campaign, but it was definitely tough in places. I also want to take a moment to apologise to the High Commissioner on behalf of my generation for not knowing how to use a post box. Very worrying. But yeah, I think that's kind of all on that side. But
thanks, Laura. We've got some questions coming, but I want to
Could I
see
just-
Rob comment,
yeah.
maybe a chaser.
Can I just mention that I think that what Laura said is really one of the really important people. I don't think the no people would dance. They're just not dancers. So that's just one of the realities that we know about our society. The yes people will dance and sing and have fun when we win. The no people would just skulk around. I think that was a very important thing.
So, Natasha, you started this kind of moment of personal reflection talking about your wedding preparations just as this was all happening. What was going through your mind at that time about whether, like Laura, were you apprehensive that it would actually go the other way? Was that sort of I guess that wasn't, it was more of a timing question on your own wedding, but how were people, I mean, you lived in Canberra, I guess, at the time, and Canberra, I think, was ahead of the curve in terms of LGTB rights, but what was the mood among the community in Australia?
Yes, Stuart, I think you hit on an important point. I was in Canberra, and the Australian Capital Territory, which is Canberra and surrounds, it's not very big, had the distinction of the jurisdiction that had the highest yes votes. It was 74% yes. We have an openly gay chief minister. We have Canberra's all about roundabouts. There is an enormous rainbow roundabout in Canberra. So I felt like I was very lucky to be in a place where, and you know, the friends we had, it was all very supportive. In fact, we had friends who were on the phones. There was less of the going door to door. It was more a phone campaign. We had friends doing that, and heterosexual friends who have no intention of getting married and don't want, you know, but they wanted us to have that option, and they danced at our wedding. And so I felt, I do think I was kind of shielded from some of that. I still had some very difficult conversations with some family and friends, but mostly not. And I know that my experience is not the typical necessarily. The mental health issues that Laura talks about were real, and the kind of losing friends and family over this were real as well. And that sense of, you know, why do I mean, we'd already decided to get married, and yet I was asking, you know, all of Australia again to say yes for me, please. At the same time though, when they did, and this again is a personal reflection, and not everyone feels this way, and a lot of people, you know, a voluntary postal survey wasn't even, you know, a real kind of vote election, so people were you know, opposed to it, and from a lot of different perspectives, but I did feel this immense relief when it came through, and at least for a while I felt like I lived in a country that just was a lot more accepting than, and not just of our right to get married, but of us, because, you know, if you're going to vote yes for 2 women or 2 men to get married, then you're okay with there being 2 women and 2 men who are in love with each other and want to celebrate that and be public about that. And so I felt that we did still have process after, so there was some nervousness because you know, I think most had said that of course they would respect the outcome of the survey, but we still had a process to go through in Parliament. And so we continued on our journey, or on track for our British law wedding. But if this hadn't been given royal assent literally the week before we got married, we would have got married on British territory at the UK High Commission in Canberra. And as soon as we left the grounds, technically we wouldn't have been married. And so what it enabled us to do was get married at the British High Commission. That was lovely. And then go home in our own backyard with 100 meters of fairy lights and all our friends, still be married. And that was you know, doubly special, I suppose. And one little anecdote, which again was really sweet. We have a 9-year-old daughter who was very excited to be a flower girl alongside a very, very dear friend who I think at the time of our wedding was 93. And our daughter came home from school one day. She'd been invited to a play date, and as it turned out, it was a play date to one of her friends, and it was a couple of her friends had decided they were having a play date so the two girls could get married. And the kids were just doing that. That wasn't, and our daughter didn't suggest that to anyone. She was just going along for the party. But that was kind of, I thought, wow, that's nice that and again, we're very privileged where we were in Canberra for that. I'm not sure that would have happened everywhere around Australia, but that certainly was, that was a nice added touch for us. And the other thing I'd say is just very quickly is that there were some people who came out during the campaign who weren't closeted, but didn't, and in senior roles in business and elsewhere, who actually decided they were going to speak out in support of the campaign. And that was really, and it wasn't just terribly flamboyant people or hardcore activists. These were just regular people that had a profile in Australia and chose to use it for this. And that was also something I thought was very special. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, and I've got lots of follow-up questions for all of you, but I want to bring some of our viewers into the conversation a bit. I've got a question here from Jennifer Bork, who's asking for all of you, and it's a good way of kind of continuing a little bit the discussion about how your own personal relationship to the idea of marriage equality, but have your own personal feelings about marriage changed over time in light of marriage equality? And I'll give you a second to think about that while I say that, I sort of made reference to it flippantly earlier, but in my own case, I had been with my partner, Brian, for 3 years, I guess, when it became legal in Ontario, 5 years when it became legal across the country, and of course, like Rob, I mean, my mother was the first on the phone. So when are you guys getting married? And by the way, adoption rights are also legal. So when are you getting me some grandkids? We had lots of friends that sort of expected that would be the normal thing, because people at that time, my age, at the time, were getting married. So you go through these phases in your life, and you seem to be always going to marriages, and then you're always going to baptisms and first communions, and then unfortunately later on it comes to different parts of our life. But it was a complex question for me. I think for a lot of people in the community. I remember back when Rob is talking about the first times we marched in parades, and the first prides we went to being more of a political protest than a celebration. I remember actually being very apprehensive the first time I went to march. In fact, my partner at the time and my boyfriend at the time, we marched together with my parents in a PFLAG group that was more about families caring for their, including their gay and lesbian, transgender sons and daughters and family members, and it was but it was really a political moment, and then. Coming out publicly, for me, it took a long time to sort of think that through. And a big part of it was deciding that I was okay with never being married. I was okay with the state not recognizing the love I had for my boyfriend, my partner. And so fast forward to many years later, when it then becomes something that's on offer, for me, it was no longer necessary, because I'd sort of reconciled myself to not needing society's recognition, or and I got to say, a lot of my family members were disappointed. They said, "Stuart, you're overthinking it. Now you get to have a party. Now you get to invite us all." And I said, "Well, listen, we can do that anyway." But I think there's something in what you said, Rob, about fighting for rights not because you personally want to exercise them, but because you want the choice to exercise them or not. Anyway, I'll stop there and maybe ask each of you, have your views about marriage and marriage equality changed since marriage equality has become a thing in each of your countries? Anyone wants to start?
I'll jump in, Stuart.
Okay.
For me, I suppose the whole process of coming out was more of that, and let me tell you, a lot of overthinking it and worrying, and I didn't know at 11 like Rob did. I'm very much a late bloomer, and when I came out, it was because I had met my now wife, and so my views hadn't really changed on marriage equality, and because we're a dual national couple, and in the UK marriage equality was legal, I suppose it was kind of like, well, I want Australia to go there too, but I didn't have a struggle then, and we'd already, obviously, before it happened in Australia, decided to get married, and partly, frankly, because we were coming here. I was going to be very proudly serving my country in a country where marriage equality was legal, and I had in my heart a hope that even if it didn't happen immediately, I would be representing a country that where you could get married as well. And so it would seem a bit odd then to get here and not be. But it was important for us to get married in Australia, and the kind of British Australia connection, being able to do it under British law was a nice touch as well. So no, it didn't change it for me, but equally I've got lots of friends who have been together decades and have no intention of getting married. And I think Rob mentioned it. Having a right doesn't mean I have to exercise it. Rights just exist. They're not about, well, you can only cash it in if you get married. So for me, it was that I wanted the choice. Now it was very easy for us. We loved each other. It was about society, but it was also about having that ceremony for ourselves and for our daughter. And it was wonderful to do it with our friends and family. But so I don't think it had changed for me, but I know a lot of people had, there were actually some very prominent members of the community who didn't agree with pushing for marriage equality. And again, I respected that view, but it seemed a bit unfair that that they might influence people not to allow everyone to have that choice.
Right. There's an interesting question here, and it's
Stuart,
go ahead.
I just want to comment on that question as well, because, and I may be in a unique position because I've performed over 650 weddings in my career. And one thing I say in almost every ceremony is the reality is that couple is already married. They have made implicit vows. They have a covenant of the way they're going to live together and be together, what restrictions or what liberties there are in that relationship. What the wedding is, and the legal act of marriage, is society saying yes, that we will support you. It gives the friends, the community, in my case, the church, other cases, the state, the opportunity to say, yes, we will love you in it, we'll support you in it. And one of the reasons I think we got married, well, let's get realistic too, weddings are expensive. And so that becomes a drawback, is how much damn money these things cost. But at the same time, it's a huge gift that I think you give to your family and friends and community, because they come and they say, we've always wanted to say we love you.
Yeah.
We've always wanted to say we respect your relationship. We love you as individuals, and we love you as a couple, and we're there for you. And some of my married straight friends would say, and now you know how bad it can be. And it's it is all of that. But the wedding and marriage are kind of two different things. So I've no one can stop couples from loving each other. What the state can do is say it's okay.
Right. The interesting about the state, the idea of state recognition, and that's kind of reflected in one of the questions from Alexandra. She says, Laura mentioned people marrying in Canada and then going back to Ireland to try to get it recognized. Natasha mentioned the recognition, the implicit recognition after getting married under British law. And Alexandra's question is, can you discuss how it relates to working, how these things work internationally? Is it automatic? Is there a burden on the individual? Are these if Natasha, if you as you say, if it hadn't gone in that direction in Australia and you've been married under British law in Australia, would that be recognized everywhere? How would that be recognized in Canada?
I'm a warm fuzzy economist, so I'm nervous making legal comment. But my understanding is that I mean, there is recognition, but it's not quite the same. I mean, our marriage would have been recognized here because Canada recognizes has marriage equality, therefore. But no, I think the legislation that we now have has that recognition in it. But it did mean that, technically under Australian law, we weren't married. And there'd already been a lot of protections put in place into, legal protections for same-sex couples and their children. But I'm not sure, I would be on shaky ground if I tried to give a definitive there. But, we wouldn't have been recognized under Australian law to be married. And that was, that's.
Now your wife, she's British Australian, Australian British. So she had the right to work and live in Australia anyway. Is in the marriage equality discussions that have happened in the three countries, how has that affected the recognition of newcomers as potential citizens or ability to work and be permanent residents? I'm not sure if that's played a part. Laura, you mentioned people who had sort of flown home to Ireland to vote. Were there people who looked at this as an opportunity to become Irish if they could marry a partner and find that as a pathway to citizenship?
So in Ireland, we don't actually have postnuptial citizenship anymore. You have to live and work in Ireland for, I think it's 5 years before you can become a citizen. But the question about, if it's recognised in different parts is actually really interesting, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, because we brought in marriage equality in 2015 in Ireland. The UK has had it for longer than that. Scotland has it, Wales had it, but Northern Ireland didn't. So people like the LGBT community in Northern Ireland were kind of stuck in the middle of all these other kind of areas that did have marriage equality, and there was a lot of people that would have come across the border into Ireland into Ireland to get married and then go back up north where it would be recognized, I think, as a civil partnership but not marriage. And then I had some friends that were living in Scotland at the time before Scotland had marriage equality, wanted to get married, came to Northern Ireland so they could get civilly partnered, and then they went back to Scotland where it was still only recognized at the time as their civil partnership, and they were able to upgrade it to marriage eventually. But there's still, I think, a lot of things that need to be ironed out in this area. But it is getting better because now more and more countries are bringing in some form of legal protections for queer couples, and I think as kind of that progresses, it will get much easier to kind of travel around and live and get visas and so on. But for Ireland anyway, we don't do postnuptial citizenship, but obviously being married makes it easier to come to Ireland because you can get a particular stamp on your passport, you can get a residency card and then build up the time you need to become a citizen.
Great. Rob, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah. One thing that obviously I think what people need to know is that the recognition of marriage is not in the country you got married in if you're not a citizenship there. It's in the country you're going back to or going to. And from the late 90s through early 2000s, and especially after it became legal in Canada, I did a lot of marriages, wedding ceremonies for Americans going home. And there were states that would recognize Canadian marriage, and this was forcing those states to deal with it. There are other states that explicitly said we accept Canadian marriages except same-sex marriages, and then that gradually evolved into that. But this gives me a really important moment for people to recognize, the Canadians in the audience, to check Global Affairs Canada's travel advisories. It is really important because, and we're going to run out of time, but it's really important to reflect on the fact that in our three countries, we have rights that are not dreamed about in many, many countries of the world. And the right to marriage isn't there. The right to live isn't there. And so when someone travels to one of these countries, as a same-sex couple, marriage, they are not necessarily protected in any way. And one needs to be very, very cautious. So from the personal standpoint, we have to exercise caution and care for our own safety. But on the political level and on the multilateral level, we're doing really important work with Australia, with Ireland, with the Netherlands, with other countries that are like-minded to say, how do we foster and encourage the promotion of human rights in countries where women are completely discriminated against, people with differing abilities are discriminated against, people, there's no protection. And one of the last rights to be given often is to LGBTQI, two-spirited people. That's way down that evolutionary rights agenda in most countries. And so just because you got married in Ireland doesn't mean you're going to be safe in Zimbabwe.
Right.
And let's be very clear that we have work to do as countries that are there. We haven't arrived completely, but boy, we have a lot. We can be very thankful, but our work is still ahead of us.
Well, I think it's a really important point you make, Rob, and especially during Pride Week, as we were saying, it's a celebration, but it's also a time to think about where we've come along in this journey, but to raise awareness and build solidarity around the world, so that more people can live in countries where they don't fear for their own personal safety. I want to jump to, there's a number of questions coming in on a sort of similar topic that I want to wrap up with, but I want one quick question to you. When we think about these national debates, it's easy for us to make assumptions about how one group or this group or that group will engage. But having watched it and lived through it, what comment might you have? And I'm going to start with Laura, because I know you have some interesting, surprising pockets of support that emerged in the campaign in Ireland. What comment do you have on the demographics of the debate, and what might have surprised you in the achievement of in the debate about the achievement of marriage rights in Ireland? We'll start there.
Yeah, so I think for us, one of the most important demographic things is that there was a huge turnout for the referendum. Usually referendum turnouts, they're not that high. You get maybe about a third of the population or slightly higher coming out to vote. But for the marriage equality referendum, because it had really sort of inflamed kind of both sides, there was a very active kind of electorate for the referendum itself. So like that was interesting in the first place. Then you had, young people came out in their droves. So the uni students in Ireland went out to every university campus. I think they set some up in secondary schools as well to register thousands and thousands of people that were just turning 18 before the vote so that they could get out and vote. You know, I am actually from the only place in Ireland that voted no to marriage equality. So that's one area of my activism I don't put in the activist CV. But it's the one place that did like vote no. But when we were campaigning there, you know, I was out in the street like handing out leaflets and stuff. And it was all these like teenagers in school coming up to us and being like, oh, like we really wish we could vote, but we can't. But you know, we're getting all of our big sisters or brothers or whoever to vote. So there was, you know, young people were definitely more interested in this referendum than I think they had been like for anything before that. And I think with a lot of these kind of issues, I think sometimes campaigners can make the mistake of writing off older people or writing off working class communities as well, because people just make assumptions about who is going to be more conservative and who isn't. Whereas in actuality, we found in Ireland anyway, that's absolutely not how it turned out to be. Like older women in particular were kind of, again, come out to your granny. That was a very important campaign that we ran. And, you know, the grandmothers of Ireland were out and forced to vote yes, kind of for their grandkids. And I think that was very interesting as well. And then like there was one ballot box in a working class area in Dublin, which was mostly yes votes, and that was one of the first boxes that was open, and it was all over Twitter, and everyone's like, okay, maybe we are going to win this. But we found, like, even just like anecdotally from me handing out leaflets on the street, it was kind of middle class and middle-aged women with young children were like, no, I don't want this leaflet, like I don't agree with this. Whereas like older women and young people were really interested in what we had to say and the points that we were making. So yeah, I think demographics, people will surprise you. I think people have a tendency to write off certain communities, but they will surprise you. And I think for us in Ireland anyway, I think it was fascinating the way the results kind of panned out on the day. But there's one constituency in Ireland that just how it has turned out for all referendums has always voted against the rest of the country, but even for marriage equality voted with the rest of the country by 33 votes, but it's still voted yes. And like my home county, and actually the county where my partner is from, that constituency was the only place to vote no, and is also where we're supposed to be getting married next year. So,
Well,
yeah, like people had their reasons for voting no, you know, and I think us having our wedding there is going to show them, you know, this is okay. You know, we were meant to be getting married at Christmas, but thank you, coronavirus, we've had to postpone it for a year. So it's, once that is, I think it'll just be like a nice thing that, you know, I can get married in my home county, even though they said no. I feel like it's just going to show people that it's okay. The sky is not falling in. We just want to celebrate with our family and friends. So
right. Rob and Natasha, did either you want to jump in on the demographic question? And I'll just throw in an angle that comes from the chat room questions in terms of experience or feedback in the Indigenous First Nations or Aboriginal communities within the debate. If either of you have recollections or experiences of how that the role that two-spirited Indigenous people have played in the voice around marriage, around expanding rights. Maybe Rob, do you want to go first?
Sort of a couple of different questions in there, but what I would, on the Indigenous people's response, what I would say, and it's very similar to other countries in the world, the vestiges of the horrendous nature of colonization are real. And the long history of Indigenous people around the world, in Canada, of acceptance of, in Canada we call them two-spirited people, of differences, was obliterated by much of the colonizing powers that emanated from Europe. And that colonization continues with right-wing American evangelicals. And I'll be very, blunt about that. I've taken them on before, not as much in Canada and Indigenous communities, but certainly in Africa and certainly in other parts of the world. We have a new wave of colonial activity, and it is repressive and it is detrimental, especially to anybody with differences such as the LGBTQI community. In the Indigenous communities in Canada, they're reclaiming their history again and again and getting rid of that Victorian, English, anti-sex, anti-equality, really, those stances. But it's slow. So it is slow. And as spirituality is reclaimed, you can still see the threads of colonization through that spirituality. And some of those vestiges are there. And we will continue to respect, but we'll also continue, I think we have to call people to their best roots, to their best past, not to their more recent past. And so I have good friends who are two-spirited people in Canada who have faced both tremendous discrimination in their communities and also grandmotherly love. And I've heard those stories from both sides. In the end, it's not that much different than the neighborhood I grew up in, Sault Ste. Marie. It is, people are people, and there's a journey, and some people get the idea of equality and rights without having an explanation. You tell them your story, they say, of course. Other people learn differently. Other people change, but take a long time. And in my own family, I mean, I have a cousin, I had a cousin who's now deceased, but her late husband met Marco and me at and they were introducing me to a family gathering, a large Irish, Italian, Catholic family in Chicago. And it started out as, this is, Sandra's cousin, Rob, and his friend. And after a few more people, it was Rob and his good friend, Marco. And then it was Rob and his very good friend, Rob. And it was kind of like, oh shit, let's just say Rob and his partner. It took that kind of, saying it over and over again. And he recognized in himself that that wasn't the story. And he had, but I'm not going to correct him. I will love him into respecting. And that puts a huge burden on us. I recognize that. But that is with everybody who is fighting for a human right or a civil right. Too much of the burden lies on us. And thank God we have allies who come in and buffet us up. But even with allies, it still depends on us claiming our right, claiming our needs, claiming our responsibilities, claiming what it is that it means to be a full, not just a citizen, a full human being.
Yeah. Natasha, were you surprised by allies that came out in the demographics of how the issue played out in Australia?
Yes and no, I suppose, and we can almost have an entire other live event about coming out stories, frankly, because if I reflect on that, if I reflect on indigeneity, intersectionality, if you like, of LGBTI Q2 plus issues, as well as Indigenous issues, etc. I think the marriage equality is a very, very small part of that story. I think it's symbolic, but it's a small part of that story. No, they didn't release data breaking down who voted yes and no in Australia. They released data by electorates. And certainly that gave some hints, but they didn't. I mean, the participation rate of different age groups was released, but not, and how many went yes and no. And in some ways I want to know, in other ways I don't want to know. I kind of, we had 61, rounding up to 62%. Yes, that's enough kind of thing. But I think as there are other issues we still need to continue to progress, then I think we do need to think carefully. And I think, you should never make assumptions about what other people think based on their demographics or where they live or what they do. And that's a lesson for, as Rob says, for any kind of human rights kind of advocacy. So I think that's very true.
Well, listen, I think we are coming close to the end, but I want to leave you with one question that's kind of a combination of a number of great questions that have come in from Momo, from Kat Little, from Gwen T, and really it's about where do we go from here. You know, what do panelists see as the next stage of LGBTQ equality in their respective countries? Momo wants to know if we do so much work on promoting equality. Do we do enough work on strengthening legal action against inequality? And Gwen is asking about your views and thoughts about when we'll have marriage equality for poly relationships. Are non-binary people able to marry? So where do you see the frontiers of this expanding quest for building a fairer, more equal, more welcoming, more inclusive society going in our countries? And just ask you to think about that for a minute or two each. And maybe Laura, do we want to start with you?
Yeah, so I think for Ireland anyway, you know, we do very progressive gender recognition legislation. It's based entirely on self-determination. I think is one of the best in the world, but it does have some flaws that I think is the next thing we need to work on. So it currently doesn't cover non-binary people. Like non-binary people can't have their genders recognized at the minute. And also there isn't a provision for gender recognition for under 18s yet with parental consent. So that's what we're working on at the minute. There's also a campaign that started in Ireland on healthcare for trans people, because there's only one clinic in Ireland that's able to sort of put you in the pathway for kind of trans healthcare. So a lot of people are traveling abroad to kind of get that healthcare. So that is a campaign that's happening at home. And then I think you know, the government has released a national LGBTI strategy for young people, and then also in general. And part of that is trying to, you know, combat bullying in schools, because that is still an issue. And obviously, you know, every step forward helps. I don't like to use the word normalized, but for example, like marriage equality normalized relationships, and obviously kids can see that and they see, oh, well, this isn't this big othering thing anymore. But of course, you know, kids' difference always does cause some bullying sometimes with children. So that is something that they are actively working on in schools and in education programs and everything. So I think for Ireland anyway, it's non-binary recognition, gender recognition for under 18s, healthcare, and bullying would be what I think.
Okay. Natasha, in Australia, where do you see the next efforts being
Yeah, and
made?
I don't like to think of it so linear, I suppose, in terms of, you know, we tick that one off, we move to the next thing on the list. But look, I think transgender rights and gender expression is an area of much debate and misinformation as well at times, I think. But that's an area certainly where there's a lot of work happening and needs to happen. And I just very quickly just say intersectionality, I think, to the kind of you know, people with a disability who are also members of the LGBTIQ2+ community, and kind of that's something that was a big theme at the Equal Rights Coalition meeting that Canada hosted. I'm starting to lose track of years, not last year, the year before. And it wasn't something I'd really focused on previously, but we were very lucky. We had an Indigenous member of our delegation, and I think it really opened my eyes to those issues. And I wouldn't say it's, you know, necessarily the next thing on the to-do list, but I think it's an important area and one that I know there's some very good people doing some very good work, and we've been lucky enough to host one or two of them here from Australia back when we used to be able to travel, and I think that's an important area. So put it that way.
Great. Rob, any final thoughts there about where we go in the future?
Well, I would say yes to Natasha, ta to Laura, and absolutely. And I think on Momo's point, we need strong laws. We need consequences for people who break those laws, when they discriminate, when they deny, when they hurt. And we've done a fairly good job in Canada getting those in place. but attitudes are slower to change. So with respect to transgendered people, trans people, we were able to change the law and add that as a grounds for appropriate grounds of discrimination in Canadian legislation. But the tragedy for trans people is still about employment. It's about housing. It's about equality. It's about being able to walk down the street without fear of abuse. It is, and then when you add the intersectionality that Natasha talks about of race and racialized communities and Indigenous communities and the disability community, and other mental health issues and addiction issues, we have to become a society that embraces difference and recognize that these are not threats to the majority. These are part of a large majority. We all have issues. We all have growing areas. We all have abilities and disabilities. Our governments have to put in laws, and those laws do not only have consequences, but they do shape social ideas too. Marriage equality shapes people's understanding of inclusion. You get through that hoop, other things open up. LGBTQ, LG rights lead to T rights. You do that, but we have stuff to do. Our work is not done. We want to ban conversion therapy. We don't think there's something to be converted from. We want to get rid of the blood ban that still exists in Canada for men who have sex with men. We're not there yet. We're close. We're close. We're not there yet. And internationally, we have to have leaders of countries who speak truth to leaders in countries that are repressive. We have to find ways to have consequences for countries that kill people because of their gender identity or their expression of their sexuality or gender. We have to have consequences, not consequences that will hurt the victims or hurt the population, but we have to look at that. We have to pull that out and start to say, what are we going to do? And that's because I believe in universal human rights. And there are rights that go beyond culture, beyond religion, beyond education, beyond class, and they have to do with our essential humanity. And that's what we're about tonight. That's what Pride is about. I think that's why we've gathered tonight to say, this is about who we are. And it's about making sure that we're for very privileged people, very privileged. And I don't take that for granted for 1 minute. I don't think anyone on this panel does. We're very privileged, and let's extend that privilege to everyone.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. Thank you. What a perfect way to sort of sum up and to get us thinking about where things go from here. That idea that we need to be we need to stop being afraid of the other, and I think at this time in the world where there are many forces that want us to retreat from the other and to block the other and stay and turn away. What you're suggesting is the opposite, a tonic of reaching out and recognizing the common humanity around the world. So it's a great way to look forward.
Yes, people dance.
I want to take make sure I take a moment as we're wrapping up for some thank yous to everyone who's tuned in to watch and participate, for your great questions, to our amazing colleagues at the Irish Embassy and Australian High Commission who've done such a great job at bringing this to you, particularly Laura, not only for being the brainchild, but also you may have had to learn about post boxes. We had to learn about how you interface Zoom and YouTube and multiple screens and all those things. So thank you to you as well. And of course, to each of you for sharing your knowledge, your history, your experience, but also for opening your hearts with us tonight. This journey that we've been talking about of building a world free of discrimination, a world where everyone gets to be who they want and love who they want. As people have mentioned, Natasha talked about it not being a linear path. I think that's such an important thing to remember. I think we often get caught up in the progress and believe or fool ourselves to believe that progress is always going to be marching forward. There are lots of twists and turns and ups and downs, and that has huge impacts on people, on our communities. And so opportunities like this to listen, to share, to learn, to laugh, even to get a little lump in your throat together helps us build community and helps us build that better world together. So thank you again for being with us, panelists, but also all of you watching out in cyberspace. Happy Pride, everyone, and thanks again. Have a great night.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks,
Happy
everyone.
Pride.